Thomas Blackwood had spent the better part of 30 years in the Cascade Mountains, far from the chaos of civilization. At 53, his weathered face told stories of countless winters, his calloused hands bore witness to decades of survival, and his grey-streaked beard had become as much a part of the wilderness as the ancient pines themselves. He had left society behind after a tragedy he rarely spoke of, a car accident that claimed his wife and daughter, and found solace in the unforgiving embrace of nature. His cabin, built with his own hands from fallen timber, sat nestled in a valley so remote that even the most adventurous hikers never stumbled upon it. The nearest town, Pinewood Falls, was a grueling 2-day hike through treacherous terrain. Thomas made the journey only twice a year, once in spring to sell his furs and pelts, and once in autumn to stock up on essentials he couldn't procure from the land: salt, ammunition, and the occasional book. For nearly 3 decades, Thomas had hunted alone. He knew every ridge, every stream, every game trail within a 50-mile radius. He moved through the forest like a ghost, his presence barely disturbing the natural order. Deer would graze within yards of him, rabbits would hop past his boots, and even the cautious elk had learned he was no threat unless hunger demanded otherwise. He took only what he needed, wasted nothing, and left no trace beyond his footprints, which the next rain would wash away. But 5 years ago, everything changed when he found Rufus. It was during one of his rare trips to town that Thomas heard whimpering coming from behind the general store. There, shivering in a cardboard box, was a puppy, some mix of German Shepherd and something wilder, perhaps wolf. The store owner, old Pete Harrison, said someone had left the pup there 3 days prior and no one wanted him. "Too wild-looking," Pete had said. "Folks around here want dogs that'll sleep by the fire, not ones that look like they might eat you in your sleep." Thomas had stared into those amber eyes, seeing something familiar, a loneliness, a displacement from the world. Without a word, he'd scooped up the trembling puppy, tucked him inside his coat, and begun the long trek home. Those first months were challenging. Rufus was indeed wild, more wolf than dog in temperament. He wouldn't come when called, refused to sleep inside the cabin, and would disappear for days at a time. Thomas never tried to break him, never forced obedience. Instead, he simply existed alongside the animal, sharing his kills, leaving the cabin door open, speaking in low tones about nothing in particular. Gradually, something remarkable happened. Rufus began choosing to stay. He'd sleep on the porch just outside the door. He'd follow Thomas on hunts, not as a trained companion, but as an equal partner. They developed an unspoken language, a tilt of the head, a shift in posture, a barely perceptible growl. Rufus would flush game toward Thomas, and Thomas would leave choice portions for Rufus. They became a seamless unit, 2 solitary souls who'd found unexpected companionship. Now, at 5 years old, Rufus was a magnificent creature, 90 pounds of muscle and thick grey-brown fur, with those penetrating amber eyes that seemed to see through everything. Visitors to the wilderness, on the rare occasion they crossed paths with Thomas, would stop and stare, uncertain whether they were looking at a very large dog or a very friendly wolf. It was early October, and Thomas was preparing for his autumn trip to town. The first snows would arrive within weeks, and he needed to stock up before the mountain passes became impassable. He'd spent the morning taking inventory. His salt was nearly gone. He was down to his last box of 30-06 ammunition, and he'd finished his only book, a worn copy of Walden he'd read at least 20 times 3 weeks ago. Rufus had been acting strangely for the past few days. The dog kept returning to the same spot, about half a mile northeast of the cabin, near a rocky outcropping Thomas called Eagle's Perch. Each time, Rufus would dig frantically, whine, then return to the cabin and stare at Thomas with those unsettling, intelligent eyes, as if trying to communicate something urgent. "What's got you so worked up, boy?" Thomas asked that morning as Rufus once again tried to lead him toward Eagle's Perch. "If you've found a rabbit den, you're more than capable of handling it yourself." But Rufus wouldn't let it go. He grabbed Thomas's sleeve gently between his teeth, something he'd never done before, and pulled. Thomas set down the pack he'd been organizing and studied his companion. In 5 years, Rufus had never behaved this way. The dog was insistent, almost desperate. "All right," Thomas sighed, reaching for his rifle. "Show me what's got you so bothered." Rufus took off immediately, glancing back every few yards to ensure Thomas was following. They moved through the familiar forest, past the stand of birches where Thomas had shot his first deer of the season, around the beaver pond that had frozen and thawed 100 times in his memory, and finally to Eagle's Perch. The rocky outcropping jutted from the mountainside like a crooked finger pointing at the sky. Thomas had used it for years as a landmark, but he'd never had reason to explore the area thoroughly. Rufus led him to a small clearing at the base of the rocks, where the earth had been disturbed by the dog's previous excavations. This is what's got you worked up?" Thomas knelt beside the hole, which was perhaps 2 feet deep. "Rufus, there's nothing—" His words died as his fingers brushed against something solid, not stone. The texture was wrong. He brushed away more dirt, his heart beginning to beat faster. Metal. Corroded, but definitely metal. Thomas pulled his hunting knife from his belt and began digging more carefully. Rufus sat beside him, tail wagging, occasionally letting out small, excited whines. Within minutes, Thomas had uncovered the edge of what appeared to be a metal box, perhaps 2 feet square. The rational part of his mind told him it was probably just an old mining equipment cache, or perhaps something left by hunters decades ago. But as he worked the box free from the earth, he noticed something that made his pulse quicken. A lock, still intact, though rusted nearly through. Thomas sat back on his heels, staring at his discovery. The box was heavy, perhaps 40 or 50 pounds. He could break the lock easily enough, but something held him back. In 30 years of living in these mountains, he'd developed an almost superstitious respect for things left buried. The earth kept its secrets for reasons. "What do you think, boy?" he asked Rufus, who was now sniffing the box intently. "Should we leave it be?" Rufus looked at him and barked once, sharp and definitive. Thomas laughed despite himself. "All right then. But we're opening it back at the cabin. I'm not going to sit out here in the open like a fool." He hoisted the box onto his shoulder, grunting at the weight, and began the trek home. With each step, his mind raced with possibilities. Treasure? Unlikely. Murder evidence? Possibly, though who would bury something out here? Old family heirlooms? That seemed most plausible, though it raised the question of what family and why this location. Back at the cabin, Thomas set the box on his rough-hewn table and studied it properly for the first time. The metal was steel, coated with what might have once been paint, now entirely consumed by rust. There were no markings, no identifying features beyond the lock. He estimated it had been buried for at least 20 or 30 years, possibly longer. Using a chisel and his hammer, Thomas broke the lock with 2 solid strikes. The hasp fell away, and he paused, his hand on the lid. Rufus sat at attention beside him, as if sensing the significance of the moment. Thomas lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth but was now little more than rotted fragments, were bundles and bundles of cash. But not ordinary cash. These were old $100 bills, bound in neat stacks with rubber bands that crumbled at the slightest touch. Thomas's hands shook as he lifted one bundle. The bills were water-damaged and discolored, but still recognizable. Benjamin Franklin's face stared up at him from every note. He rifled through the bundle. 50 bills, $5,000, and there were dozens of bundles, perhaps hundreds. He sat down heavily in his chair, his mind reeling. This wasn't treasure, this was a crime. No one buried this amount of cash in the middle of nowhere unless they had something to hide. Bank robbery, drug money, ransom, each possibility was worse than the last. Thomas looked at Rufus, who had placed his head on Thomas's knee, sensing his distress. "What have we found, boy?" he whispered. "What have we gotten ourselves into?" As the afternoon light faded and long shadows crept across his cabin floor, Thomas Blackwood sat surrounded by more money than he'd ever imagined seeing in his lifetime, and for the first time in 30 years, he felt something he thought he'd left behind forever: fear. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He sat at his table, methodically counting and documenting what Rufus had unearthed. By the time dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of amber and rose, he had his answer: 400 bundles of $50 bills each. $2 million, give or take, depending on how much the water damage had ruined. But it was the second box that truly shook him. After finding the first cache, Thomas had returned to Eagle's Perch with Rufus and properly excavated the area. 3 feet down and 2 feet to the left of where the first box had been, they'd found another, and another. By sunset, Thomas had uncovered 5 boxes in total, each containing the same cargo of bundled hundreds. $10 million, buried in the Cascade Mountains. On land, Thomas had considered his personal domain for 3 decades. The bills themselves told a story. They were old, series from the 1980s and early 1990s, non-sequential serial numbers, suggesting the bills had been in circulation before being collected. The boxes showed no signs of tampering since being buried, and the state of decay suggested they'd been underground for at least 25 to 30 years. Thomas had spent his adult life avoiding the complications of civilization, and now those complications had literally been dug up in his backyard. He paced his cabin floor as Rufus watched from his spot by the fireplace, the dog's amber eyes tracking his master's agitated movements. The moral calculus was straightforward enough. This money belonged to someone, or more accurately, had been stolen from someone. Banks, perhaps, individuals, the government. It didn't matter. Keeping it would make him complicit in whatever crime had originally put it in the ground. But reporting it, that opened a Pandora's box Thomas had no desire to face. Questions he couldn't answer. Attention he'd spent 30 years avoiding. Investigators tramping through his sanctuary, disturbing the peace he'd fought so hard to maintain. And for what? To return money to some insurance company that had probably written it off decades ago? There was a third option, of course. One he'd considered around 3 a.m. when exhaustion and fear had loosened his moral moorings. Simply rebury the boxes, forget they existed, let sleeping dogs lie. Literally, he thought, glancing at Rufus. But even as the idea crossed his mind, Thomas knew he couldn't do it. Whatever else he'd become in his years of solitude, he wasn't a thief. His father, a mining engineer who'd lived by a strict code of honor, had raised him better than that. "We're going to town," Thomas announced to Rufus as morning light filled the cabin. "Today. Not next week like planned. Today." The trip to Pinewood Falls usually took 2 days, but Thomas pushed the pace, driven by an urgency he couldn't entirely explain. They moved through familiar terrain at double speed, Thomas's pack heavy with 2 of the boxes, a sample to show authorities, while the rest remained hidden in his cabin beneath the floorboards. Rufus sensed the tension and stayed close, his wild nature subdued by his master's anxiety. They made camp that first night at Miller's Creek, where Thomas had stopped hundreds of times before, but this time he didn't build a fire. Didn't want to advertise his presence. Instead, he sat in the darkness, watching stars wheel overhead and wondering how his solitary life had become so suddenly complicated. They reached Pinewood Falls by mid-afternoon of the second day. The town hadn't changed much in the years Thomas had been visiting. Still the same wooden storefronts, still the same handful of pickup trucks parked along Main Street, still the same suspicious glances from locals who'd never quite trusted the wild man from the mountains. The sheriff's office was a small building squeezed between the general store and a diner that served breakfast all day. Sheriff Robert Coleman had held the position for 12 years, elected and re-elected largely because nobody else wanted the job. He was 50, overweight, and generally competent at handling the minor disputes and occasional drunken, disorderly calls that constituted law enforcement in Pinewood Falls. Thomas tied Rufus to a post outside, the dog attracting immediate attention from passers-by, and stepped into the office. A bell above the door announced his arrival. Sheriff Coleman looked up from his paperwork, recognition flickering across his face. "Blackwood, wasn't expecting you until next month. Everything all right up at your place?" Thomas set the heavy pack on the floor with a thud. "We need to talk, Sheriff, privately." 10 minutes later, both boxes were open on Coleman's desk, and the sheriff's face had gone pale. He picked up a bundle of bills, examined them, set them down, and picked up another, as if hoping the first had been an illusion. "Jesus Christ, Blackwood, where did you—" He stopped himself, holding up a hand. "Wait, start from the beginning. Tell me everything." Thomas did, keeping his voice level and factual. Rufus's strange behavior, the digging, the discovery, the additional boxes, the approximate total. Throughout the narrative, Coleman's expression cycled between disbelief, concern, and what might have been excitement. When Thomas finished, Coleman leaned back in his chair, which creaked ominously under his weight. $10 million! You're telling me there's $10 million buried on your property?" "That's my estimate. Could be more if there are other caches I haven't found. And you brought it straight here, didn't keep any, didn't spend any." "What would I spend it on, Sheriff? I've got everything I need." Coleman laughed, a short, sharp bark of amusement. "You're either the most honest man I've ever met or the dumbest. Probably both." He stood and began pacing, mirroring Thomas's agitation from the previous night. "All right, here's what's going to happen. I need to make some calls. FBI probably, state police. This is way above my pay grade." "FBI." Thomas felt his stomach drop. "Sheriff, I just want to report what I found and get back to my cabin." "Not how this works, I'm afraid. Money like this, buried like this, it's evidence in a federal crime. You're a witness. They're going to want statements, probably want to excavate the site properly. You're looking at weeks of involvement, minimum." "Weeks?" Thomas's voice rose despite his attempts to stay calm. "Sheriff, I don't—" He struggled to articulate 30 years of careful isolation, the fragile peace he'd built, now crumbling. "I left that world behind. All of it. That's why I'm out there." Coleman's expression softened slightly. "I know, Blackwood, everyone in town knows your story. But you've stumbled onto something big, and there's no walking away from it now. Not if you want to do right by whoever that money was stolen from." Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the walls closing in. This was his nightmare, the modern world with all its complications, demands, and intrusions, forcing its way back into his life. "How long before they get here?" "I'll make the calls now. FBI field offices in Seattle. They can probably have someone here by tomorrow morning. You'll need to stay in town." "I'll camp outside." "In October? Don't be ridiculous. There's a room above Pete's store he rents out. Not fancy, but it's warm and dry." Thomas shook his head. "Can't bring Rufus inside. We'll camp." Coleman sighed but didn't argue. He'd learned years ago that Thomas Blackwood was as immovable as the mountains he lived in. "Suit yourself. But you stay in town, you understand? Don't go running off into your wilderness before the feds get here." "I gave you my word by coming here," Thomas said quietly. "I don't run." As Thomas left the sheriff's office, he found Rufus surrounded by a small crowd of children, all keeping a respectful distance but fascinated by the wolf-like dog. Rufus endured the attention with patient dignity, though his eyes lit up when Thomas appeared. They made camp that evening in a small clearing just outside town, close enough to keep his promise to the sheriff, but far enough to avoid the noise and lights of civilization. Thomas built a small fire and shared his dried meat with Rufus, both of them staring into the flames. "I did the right thing, didn't I, boy?" Thomas asked. Rufus laid his head on Thomas's leg. offering silent companionship if not answers. The FBI arrived the next morning, 2 agents in dark suits that seemed absurdly out of place in Pinewood Falls. Special Agent Catherine Morrison was in her 40s, sharp-featured and sharper-minded, with the kind of intensity that suggested she didn't suffer fools. Her partner, Agent David Chen, was younger, mid-30s, with an easy manner that probably put suspects at ease before they realized how carefully he was observing them. The interrogation, though they called it an interview, lasted 6 hours. They wanted every detail, exact location, condition of the boxes, anything Thomas might have seen over the years that seemed unusual. Hikers in places they shouldn't be, vehicles where vehicles couldn't go, anything. Thomas answered honestly, but the truth was underwhelming. In 30 years, he'd seen nothing unusual. The mountains were empty because they were remote and difficult. That was their appeal. He was valuable as a witness only because he'd happened to be there when Rufus started digging. "I need to be honest with you, Mr. Blackwood," Agent Morrison said as the day drew to a close. "This is going to take time. We need to properly excavate the site, search the surrounding area, run forensic analysis on the boxes and bills. You're looking at a minimum of 2 to 3 weeks before we're done up there." 2 to 3 weeks. Thomas felt his carefully maintained composure cracking. "I have a life up there. I need to prepare for winter. I can't just abandon my cabin for weeks." "We're not asking you to abandon it," Chen interjected smoothly, "but we will need access, and we'll need you available for questions. How about this? You can return to your cabin, but we'll have a rotating team of agents and forensic specialists working the site. You'll have company, but you'll be home." Thomas wanted to refuse, wanted to tell them all to go to hell, wanted to retreat to the solitude he'd known and loved. But he'd known from the moment he opened that first box that his solitary life was over, at least temporarily. "Fine," he said finally, "but Rufus and I return today. Your people can follow tomorrow, and they respect the land, Agent Morrison. They pack out what they pack in, they don't disturb more than necessary, and they follow my rules while they're there." Morrison smiled slightly, the first warmth he'd seen from her. "Deal. And Mr. Blackwood? Thank you. A lot of people would have kept this quiet. You did the right thing." As Thomas and Rufus began the long hike home that afternoon, Thomas wondered if the right thing and the easy thing were ever the same. The sun was setting behind the peaks, painting the world in shades of gold and shadow, and for the first time in 30 years, his mountain sanctuary felt less like a haven and more like a crime scene. Rufus trotted ahead, occasionally looking back as if to say, "Come on, we're going home." But as Thomas followed his faithful companion back into the wilderness, he couldn't shake the feeling that home would never quite be the same again. The FBI's arrival at Thomas's cabin was like watching an alien invasion in slow motion. They came in waves over the following days. Forensic specialists hauling equipment that seemed absurdly sophisticated for a wilderness excavation, agents in tactical gear conducting grid searches, even a helicopter that circled overhead before landing in the nearest clearing, disturbing game for miles around. Thomas watched from his porch, Rufus pressed against his leg, both of them displaced in their own home. Agent Morrison had kept her word about respecting the land, but respect couldn't change the fundamental disruption. His sanctuary had become a crime scene, his morning coffee accompanied by the sound of generators and ground-penetrating radar. By the end of the first week, the team had excavated 17 additional boxes from various locations around Eagle's Perch. The total haul, $34 million. The bills ranged from 1985 to 1993, all hundreds, all non-sequential. Someone had buried a fortune in Thomas's wilderness, and now the federal government wanted to know who and why. Agent Chen proved to be the liaison, making daily trips from the main excavation site to the cabin to update Thomas. The young agent seemed genuinely fascinated by Thomas's lifestyle, asking questions about hunting, tracking, surviving winters that would kill most people. In return, Thomas learned more about the investigation than he probably should have. The working theory, Chen explained one evening over coffee, real coffee which the agents had brought and which Thomas had forgotten he missed, is that this was a major drug operation from the late 80s, early 90s. That was peak Colombian cartel time. Someone moved product through the Pacific Northwest, buried the proceeds, and either got arrested or killed before they could retrieve it. 30 years is a long time to leave money in the ground, Thomas observed. Exactly, which suggests our suspect or suspects met a bad end. Morrison is running down missing persons from that era, cross-referencing with known drug trafficking cases in Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia. It's a lot of data to sift through. Thomas nodded, only half listening. His attention was on Rufus, who had been acting strangely again. The dog kept returning to a spot about 100 yards east of the cabin, near a small stream Thomas called Whispering Creek. It was the same insistent behavior that had led to the original discovery, and Thomas had learned to trust his companion's instincts. "Agent Chen," Thomas interrupted, "your people searched Whispering Creek, didn't they?" "The stream about 100 yards east? Yes, ground-penetrating radar showed nothing but rock and water. Why?" "Rufus keeps going there. Same way he acted before we found the first box." Chen set down his coffee, suddenly alert. "Show me." They found Rufus at the creek bank, digging furiously at a spot where the water had eroded the soil, exposing a tumble of rocks. Thomas knelt beside the dog, running his hands over the stones. Something felt wrong. The arrangement was too regular, too deliberate. "These rocks were placed," Thomas said slowly. "This isn't natural erosion." Chen radioed for the forensic team, and within an hour they'd carefully dismantled what proved to be a deliberate cairn. Beneath it, protected from water by layers of tar-sealed canvas, was a waterproof case. Not a box of money this time. Something different. Agent Morrison arrived as they were extracting the case. She supervised its opening personally, her expression grim as the contents were revealed: documents, files, photographs, and a leather-bound journal, surprisingly well preserved. Morrison flipped through the journal, her face paling with each page. Finally, she looked up at Thomas, then at her assembled team. "Everyone not directly involved in this excavation, clear out, now. Blackwood, Chen, you two stay." When the others had retreated to a respectful distance, Morrison spoke quietly, urgently. "This isn't drug money. This is so much worse." The journal belonged to a man named Marcus Holloway, a DEA agent who had disappeared in 1993. According to the entries, Holloway had been running an off-books operation for years, skimming money from drug busts and deposits. But he wasn't working alone. His partners included 3 other federal agents, 2 local sheriffs, and a prosecutor. $34 million over 8 years. Morrison read from the journal. Split 7 ways, buried in remote locations across the Northwest. Eagle's Perch was Holloway's personal cache. He was planning to retrieve it and disappear, start a new life far from the corruption he'd become part of. "What happened to him?" Thomas asked. According to his last entry, dated March 15, 1993, his partners found out he was planning to run. He writes about needing to disappear immediately, about leaving the money because going back for it would be suicide. The last line says, "If anyone finds this, tell my daughter I'm sorry." Chen leaned against a tree, looking sick. "A federal corruption ring. How many of these people are still alive, still in positions of power?" "That's what we're going to find out," Morrison said grimly. "Blackwood, this journal names names, specifics. This isn't just about recovering stolen money anymore. This is about bringing down law enforcement officials who've been operating above the law for 3 decades. Thomas felt the weight of those words settle over him like a physical burden. "You're saying some of these people might still be active? Still working?" Two of the named individuals are still employed by federal agencies. One is a deputy sheriff in Oregon. The prosecutor died in 2001. Car accident, though now I'm wondering about that. The other three I'll need to track down." Morrison fixed Thomas with an intense stare. This investigation just became extremely sensitive and extremely dangerous. These people killed before. Holloway's journal suggests they murdered at least 2 witnesses. If they find out we've uncovered this evidence, they'll want to tie up loose ends, Chen finished quietly. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Thomas had become a liability to people who'd proven willing to kill to protect their secrets. People with resources, connections, and 3 decades of practice covering their tracks. "We need to bring you in," Morrison said. "Protective custody until we've made arrests." "No." Thomas's response was immediate and absolute. "I'm not leaving my home. I'm not hiding. I've spent 30 years out here specifically to avoid this kind of complication, and I'm not abandoning that now. Mr. Blackwood, these are dangerous people. Agent Morrison, with all respect, I've survived 3 decades in one of the harshest environments in the country. I've tracked cougars, fought off bears, weathered storms that would kill a man in hours. I'm not helpless." "This isn't wildlife, Thomas," Chen interjected, using his first name. "These are trained professionals who know how to hurt people." Thomas looked at Rufus, who had been watching the exchange with those intelligent amber eyes. Then he looked back at Morrison. "How long until you can make arrests? With this evidence, we can move fast. 3 days, maybe 4, but that's 3 days these people have to learn what we've found." "Then I suggest you move very carefully," Thomas said. "Because I'm not leaving, and I'm not hiding. This is my home. They don't get to take that from me." Morrison studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I can assign agents for protection." "No, their presence would just advertise that something's happening. I'll be fine. At least take a satellite phone. If anything happens, anything unusual, you call immediately." Thomas accepted the phone, though he had no intention of calling anyone. He'd handled his own problems for 30 years. He could handle a few more days. The FBI team departed the next morning, leaving behind only the satellite phone and instructions Thomas largely ignored. Morrison promised to call when arrests were made, and Chen clasped his shoulder in what might have been respect or sympathy. Thomas wasn't sure which. Alone again. Truly alone for the first time in weeks, Thomas sat on his porch and tried to reclaim the peace he'd known. But it was gone, perhaps forever. The wilderness that had been his escape was now connected to corruption, murder, and money. The sanctuary was tainted. "We did the right thing," he told Rufus for the 100th time. The dog, as always, offered no judgment, just companionship. The attack came on the 3rd night. Thomas woke to Rufus's low growl, not the warning bark he used for bears or the excited yip for deer, but a sound Thomas had rarely heard. Pure threat. He reached for his rifle immediately, every sense suddenly sharp and alert. Through the cabin's small window, he saw nothing at first. Then, movement. 2 figures, barely visible in the moonlight, approaching from different angles. Professional spacing, coordinated approach. Not hikers who'd stumbled across his cabin by accident. Thomas moved to the door, rifle in hand. Rufus was beside him, hackles raised, teeth bared. "FBI?" Thomas called out, though he already knew the answer. "We just want to talk, Blackwood," a voice called back. Male, middle-aged, with a Western accent. "About what you found, about what you told the FBI. You're on my property. Leave, now." "Can't do that. You've become a problem we need to solve." Thomas's response was to chamber around loudly. The sound echoed across the clearing, unmistakable in its meaning. "Last warning." A shot rang out, splintering wood above Thomas's head. Not warning shot, a genuine attempt to kill that he'd avoided only by inches. Rufus exploded through the door before Thomas could stop him. a grey streak of fury moving faster than seemed possible. What happened next occurred in seconds but felt like hours. Rufus took down the shooter on the left, going for the gun arm with precision that suggested this wasn't his first violent encounter. The man screamed. His partner tried to bring his weapon around, but Thomas was faster, putting a round through the man's shoulder, aiming to disable, not kill. The wounded man dropped his gun and fell. Rufus had released the first shooter, but stood over him, growling, ready to attack again if necessary. Both intruders were down, both wounded, neither dead. Thomas approached carefully, keeping his rifle trained on them. In the moonlight, he could see they were older men, 50s or 60s, with the kind of hardened faces that came from a lifetime of difficult choices. One of them, the shoulder wound, looked up at Thomas with something like respect. "Holloway said you were tough, whoever ended up on this land," the man wheezed. "Said the mountains didn't suffer fools." "You knew Holloway?" "Killed him. April '93 in a ravine about 5 miles south of here. Couldn't have him running off with information about our operation. Couldn't have him growing a conscience after all those years." Thomas felt sick, but kept his rifle steady. "The FBI knows everything. Holloway's journal named you all. This was pointless." "Maybe. Or maybe we wanted to make sure there weren't any other witnesses before we disappeared. We've got 34 million reasons to try." The satellite phone in Thomas's pocket chirped. Morrison, calling with the arranged signal that arrests had been made. 3 ring patterns, all clear. Thomas answered, keeping his eyes on the wounded men. "Blackwood," Morrison's voice was urgent. "We've got them. All 5 survivors are in custody. Are you—" "I've got 2 more for you," Thomas interrupted. "They came to my cabin tonight. They're wounded but alive. You'll want to send a medical team along with the arrest team." There was a brief pause. Then Morrison's voice came back, filled with something that might have been admiration. "You never did need protective custody, did you?" "No, Agent Morrison. I didn't." 3 weeks later, Thomas stood at Eagle's Perch with Rufus beside him. The FBI had finished their work, filled in their excavation, and done their best to restore the land. It would never be quite the same, but nature had a way of reclaiming her own. In a year, you'd hardly know anyone had been there. The case had made national news. A 30-year-old corruption ring finally exposed, 7 current and former law enforcement officials arrested, $34 million recovered. Thomas's name had been kept out of the reports at his insistence, referred to only as a local resident who wishes to remain anonymous. There had been talk of a reward, the government returning a percentage of recovered funds to the person who'd found them. Thomas had declined. He hadn't done this for money. He'd done it because it was right, because his father had raised him to do the right thing, even when it was difficult, even when it upended everything you'd built. Agent Chen had visited one last time before the team departed for good, bringing gifts, coffee, ammunition, books. "Morrison wanted me to tell you something," Chen had said. "Holloway's daughter. She's in her 40s now, has kids of her own. She wanted you to know that finding that journal, learning what happened to her father, it gave her closure. 30 years of not knowing, and now she does. You did that." Thomas had nodded but said nothing. Some things didn't require words. Now, standing at the place where Rufus had changed both their lives forever, Thomas felt, what? Not regret. The money would be returned to the people it had been stolen from, or at least their insurance companies. The corrupt officials would face justice. Holloway's daughter had her answers. The right things had happened. But his sanctuary was different now. He couldn't look at Eagle's Perch without thinking of corruption and death, couldn't walk to Whispering Creek without remembering Morrison's pale face as she read Holloway's journal. The wilderness was still beautiful, still vast, still his, but it was haunted now by knowledge of what men were capable of, even out here in the middle of nowhere. "Was it worth it, boy?" Thomas asked Rufus, who was sniffing around the now-filled excavation site. All this trouble, all this disruption, was finding that money worth losing our peace. Rufus looked up at him with those amber eyes, and for a moment Thomas could have sworn the dog understood the question. Then Rufus trotted over and pressed against Thomas's leg, offering the same silent companionship he'd provided for 5 years. Thomas ran his hand through Rufus's thick fur and made a decision. "We're not going to let them take this from us," he said quietly. "This is still our home, still our mountain. What happened here? It's done. Finished. Tomorrow we go hunting like always. We live our lives like always. We don't let their corruption poison our sanctuary." As if in agreement, Rufus let out a single decisive bark. They walked back to the cabin together as the sun began to set, painting the peaks in shades of purple and gold. Thomas built a fire, made his simple dinner, and settled into his chair with one of the new books Chen had brought, a collection of Jack London's stories he'd never read. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, soft and silent, covering the scarred earth at Eagle's Perch like a blanket. By morning, there would be no trace of the FBI's work, no sign that anything unusual had ever happened. The mountain would reclaim its secrets, as it always did. Rufus slept by the fire, his breathing deep and steady. Thomas watched his companion and thought about the strange chain of events that had led them here. If he'd never found Rufus, the dog would never have dug up that first box. The money would have stayed buried. The corruption would have remained hidden. Holloway's daughter would never have gotten her answers. Sometimes, Thomas reflected, the universe conspired to bring truth to light, no matter how deeply it was buried. And sometimes it used the most unlikely instruments. A hermit who'd fled civilization and a wolf dog who couldn't leave well enough alone. A week later, Thomas made his delayed trip to Pinewood Falls for his autumn supplies. Sheriff Coleman greeted him with uncharacteristic warmth, shaking his hand and insisting on buying him lunch at the diner. Word had gotten around, not the details, but enough. The quiet hermit from the mountains had stumbled onto something big, had done right by it, and had earned the town's respect in the process. Pete Harrison at the general store refused payment for Thomas's supplies. "Consider it a thank you," Pete said, "from all of us. What you did, bringing that money in instead of keeping it, that says something about a man's character." Thomas tried to argue, but Pete was adamant. Finally, Thomas accepted with quiet gratitude, adding the saved money to his modest cash reserves. He also bought a new collar for Rufus, sturdy leather with a brass name tag that simply read, "Rufus, Eagle's Perch." "That your dog?" a young woman asked as Thomas was leaving the store. She couldn't have been more than 25, with kind eyes and an earnest expression. "The one that found all that money?" "He's his own dog," Thomas replied. "I just have the privilege of his company." She smiled. "My grandfather used to say that about his dogs, said the good ones chose you, not the other way around." She extended her hand. "I'm Sarah Holloway. Marcus Holloway was my father." Thomas felt his breath catch. This was the daughter, the one Morrison had mentioned, the one who'd spent 30 years not knowing what happened to her father. "I'm sorry for your loss," Thomas said quietly, shaking her hand. "Thank you. And thank you for finding his journal. I know now that he died trying to do the right thing, trying to expose the corruption instead of running from it. That matters to me. It matters to my kids knowing their grandfather wasn't just a criminal." "He made mistakes," Thomas acknowledged, "but in the end he tried to fix them. That takes courage." Sarah nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "The FBI said you didn't want any reward. Is that true?" "I didn't do it for a reward." "I know. That's why I wanted to give you this." She handed him a small package wrapped in brown paper. "It was my father's. I think he'd want you to have it." Thomas unwrapped the package to find a leather-bound field journal, blank, unused, its pages waiting to be filled. On the inside cover, in careful handwriting, were 3 words: Truth survives everything. He was going to use it to document his new life, Sarah explained. After he disappeared, he never got the chance, but maybe you could use it. Document your life up there in the mountains. Make sure the truth of how you live, honestly, simply, honorably, survives too. Thomas looked at the journal, feeling its weight in his hands. It was a gift, but more than that. It was a charge, a reminder that how you lived mattered, that integrity wasn't situational, that truth did survive everything if you were brave enough to uphold it. "I'll put it to good use," he promised. Sarah smiled, squeezed his hand once more, and walked away. Thomas watched her go, then looked down at Rufus. "Ready to go home, boy?" Rufus's tail wagged enthusiastically. They left Pinewood Falls that afternoon, their packs full of supplies, and Thomas's mind full of thoughts. The 2-day journey back to the cabin felt different this time. Not a retreat from civilization, but a return to something precious and deliberately chosen. That night, camped at Miller's Creek under a canopy of stars, Thomas opened Holloway's journal and wrote his first entry. October 28th, 2025, Eagle's Perch, Cascade Mountains. My name is Thomas Blackwood. I've lived in these mountains for 30 years, and in that time, I've learned something that civilization often forgets, that a man's worth isn't measured by what he accumulates, but by what he does when no one is watching. That honor isn't convenient, and integrity isn't negotiable. This month, my companion Rufus found something that changed both our lives, proof of corruption and a test of character. We passed that test, though it cost us the perfect peace we'd known. But I'm learning that peace bought with ignorance isn't real peace. Truth might be uncomfortable, but it's the only foundation worth building on. Tomorrow, we go back to our life, hunting, surviving, existing in harmony with a wilderness that asks nothing of us but respect. But we're different now. We know what we're capable of when tested. We know that 30 years of solitude didn't make us weak or selfish. It made us strong enough to do what was right, even when it was hard. The mountain keeps its secrets, but not forever. Eventually, truth comes to light. I'm glad we were the ones to bring it there. Thomas closed the journal and looked at Rufus, who was curled up by the fire, watching him with those eternal amber eyes. "What do you think, boy? Philosophical enough for a hermit?" Rufus yawned enormously and laid his head on his paws, clearly unimpressed with human introspection. Thomas laughed, a real, genuine laugh that echoed across the dark forest. It was the first time he'd laughed in weeks, and it felt like reclaiming something essential. They reached the cabin the next day, and Thomas stood on his porch, surveying his domain. The snow had continued falling, covering everything in pristine white. The scars at Eagle's Perch were invisible. The stream flowed as it always had. The peaks stretched toward heaven, unchanged by human drama. Home, still home, always home. Over the following weeks, Thomas settled back into his routines with deliberate intention. He hunted, preserved meat for winter, repaired his cabin roof, chopped wood. Every evening he wrote in Holloway's journal, not about the money or the investigation, but about his daily life, the tracks he found, the weather patterns he observed, the small moments of beauty that made wilderness living worthwhile. Rufus returned to his normal self, though occasionally Thomas would catch him staring toward Eagle's Perch with what might have been satisfaction. The dog had changed their lives with his insistent digging, and sometimes Thomas wondered if Rufus understood the magnitude of what he'd done. Winter came early that year, fierce and unforgiving. Thomas and Rufus weathered storms that buried the cabin in 6 feet of snow, hunted during brief breaks in the weather, and spent long evenings by the fire, Thomas reading or writing, Rufus dreaming whatever dreams dogs dream. It was during one of these evenings in mid-December that Thomas heard a sound that didn't belong, a helicopter. He stepped outside, Rufus at his side, and watched as a small aircraft circled once, then departed. Minutes later, there was a knock at his door. Agent Morrison stood there, bundled against the cold, a pack on her back. "Surprised?" she asked. "Very," Thomas admitted. "The investigation is over." "It is. All 5 convicted, long sentences. The money's been returned, everything wrapped up nicely." She stamped snow from her boots. "I came to check on you, make sure you were all right after everything." Thomas studied her. "You hiked up here in winter just to check on me?" "Chen wanted to come too, but I told him one surprise visitor was enough." She smiled. "May I come in? It's freezing out here." Thomas stepped aside, and Morrison entered the cabin looking around with open curiosity. It was sparse, functional, impeccably maintained. Exactly what you'd expect from a man who'd lived here for 30 years. "Coffee?" Thomas offered. "Please." They sat at his table, the same table where he'd first counted $34 million, and talked. Morrison shared details of the trial, the confessions, the ripple effects through law enforcement agencies. But eventually, the conversation turned more personal. "Can I ask you something?" Morrison said. "Why did you really come to the mountains? Everyone says it was the accident, losing your family, but I think there's more to it." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, watching snow fall outside his window. "The accident destroyed my world," he said finally. "My wife, my daughter. They were everything. When they died, I couldn't exist in a world that would allow something so random, so pointless. Every person I saw reminded me of what I'd lost. Every conversation felt hollow. Every moment felt like treading water in an ocean of grief." "So you ran." "I ran," Thomas agreed. "Not from grief. I brought that with me. I ran from a world that suddenly made no sense. Out here, things are simpler. A bear is a bear. Winter is winter. Cause and effect, action and consequence. It's all straightforward, honest. The mountain doesn't lie or make promises it can't keep." And 30 years later, Thomas looked at Rufus, then back at Morrison. 30 years later, I've learned that even the wilderness isn't separate from the world. Corruption finds its way into the remotest places. Good and evil exist everywhere. You can't escape the human condition by running from humans. So why stay? Because this is my home now, because I've made peace with my grief, and this is where I did it. Because sometimes the right place to be isn't where things are easy, but where they're real. He paused, then added, "And because I have a companion who needs me, and whom I need. Isn't that enough?" Morrison nodded slowly. "More than enough." She finished her coffee and stood. "I should go before the weather gets worse. But I wanted you to know something, Thomas. What you did, bringing in that money, risking yourself to do the right thing, it reminded a lot of people why they got into law enforcement in the first place, to serve justice, not self-interest. You didn't just solve a 30-year-old case. You reminded us what integrity looks like." After Morrison left, Thomas stood on his porch and watched the helicopter disappear into the grey sky. Then he went inside, added wood to the fire, and opened Holloway's journal. December 15th, 2025. Special Agent Morrison visited today, hiked through a snowstorm to check on a hermit she barely knows. It made me realize something I'd forgotten. People are capable of remarkable goodness. For 30 years, I've isolated myself from humanity because I associated it with pain and loss. But humanity is also capable of courage, integrity, and kindness. I think I'm ready to stop running. Not from the wilderness, but from the world. This will always be my home, but perhaps I don't need to be quite so alone. Perhaps there's room in my life for occasional visitors, for friendships maintained at a distance, for connections that don't require me to abandon the peace I've found. Rufus would approve, I think. He's always been better at balancing solitude with companionship than I have. Thomas closed the journal and looked at his companion. "What do you say, boy? Ready for spring, boy?" "Ready," Rufus, curled by the fire in perfect contentment, opened one eye, then closed it again. The answer clearly was that he was ready for a nap, and spring could wait. Thomas laughed and settled into his chair with a new book. Outside, the snow continued falling, adding another layer to the blanket that covered Eagle's perch, covering 34 million secrets that would never be buried again. Inside, a man and his dog sat by the fire, their lives forever changed by a simple act of digging, their futures secured not by money, but by the knowledge that when tested, they'd chosen correctly. The mountain stood eternal, witness to human folly and human honor in equal measure, and in a small cabin in its shadow, Thomas Blackwood had finally found what he'd been searching for all along. Not escape from the world, but peace within it. Not isolation from humanity, but a chosen life lived with integrity. It was enough. It would always be enough.